think we've got him. Here he is, Mr. Papadopoulos. Look, we're hearing now that the US President says that these latest sanctions are being implemented because of Russia's efforts to destabilise Ukraine, and yet Russia is the country to have backed the ceasefire. So how does that weigh up?
Well, the American government has been playing a duplicitous role in Ukraine. The war in eastern Ukraine was America's war, and it was a war that was instigated by the American government for two reasons. Firstly, to bring Ukraine into the West's sphere of influence, for it to eventually join the European Union and for it to join NATO and thereby encircle Russia completely on its western borders in Europe. And the second reason was to justify a permanent NATO presence in Eastern Europe. The Americans are acutely aware that the Russia of today is not the Russia of the 1990s. Russia today is strong politically, economically and militarily, and the American government feels very threatened by that. So that's why the Americans are pushing ahead with these sanctions as a way of attempting to cripple a resurgent Russia on the international stage.
But in terms of what's happening on the ground, we're hearing today that the prisoner swap has gone ahead as planned. So these are obvious steps, aren't they, towards peace? How can Mr. Obama then come out and say Russia is still aiming to destabilise Ukraine?
Well, Russia brought peace to Syria last year in that it averted a Western military attack, and Russia, 1 year on, has brought peace to eastern Ukraine. But Russia is damned if it does and it's damned if it doesn't. The problem for the West is that Russia is a strong country today. There was no issue for the West during the 1990s when Russia was on its knees and was subservient to the West and subservient to the IMF. But 20 years on, Russia is in a very, very different situation. So it doesn't matter if the ceasefire holds in eastern Ukraine. The West, led by the Americans and encouraged by the Americans, will do all in its means to try and bring about a situation where Russia is weakened dramatically in Europe, which would then result in Russia being dramatically weakened in the world. It's a game of chess that the Americans are playing, and they are not going to back off. Even if the ceasefire in Ukraine holds, and hopefully it will kick off again somewhere else, perhaps in Georgia, perhaps in Moldova. The Americans are intent on encircling Russia on its western borders.
We're hearing, as we might expect, that Moscow says it will retaliate with sanctions of its own. How painful could they prove to be for Europe?
Well, let's be clear about it. The Russian economy is going to suffer because the countries which are placing the sanctions on Russia, they're not poor countries, they're not obscure countries, they're some of the most powerful countries in the world. However, if Russia does retaliate, that will have an effect on those countries which are placing those sanctions. We've already heard very serious concerns in countries in Europe such as Britain, Spain, Germany, Czech Republic and Bulgaria about the effects on their economy of Russia placing sanctions on them. In Britain, for example, the company JCB, which is one of the biggest manufacturers of construction equipment in the world, has warned, the British government warned Prime Minister David Cameron about the detrimental effects that it will have on his company, because JCB has been supplying equipment to Russia for well over 30 years. So it's a very dangerous situation for those countries which are placing sanctions on Russia, and in particular European sanctions, because Europe is starting to show signs of coming out of the recession. These sanctions, should Russia place them back, which Russia would have every right to do, it's tit for tat, could have an adverse effect on that recovery for Europe.
OK, we do have to leave it there, but thanks very much for your thoughts. That was Marcus Papadopoulos, editor of Politics First. Thank you.